Queerness in video games is not a new concept. Scholar Bonnie Ruberg would suggest it's been in games since Pong. A game of table tennis between two seemingly identical blocks could represent a homosocial or homoerotic bond between two men bouncing intimate ideas back and forward. As games have evolved technically, and for the most part, as storytelling tools for writers and developers, it's no surprise then that there is a rise in queer representation in stories, characters, and themes. But we should be careful to assume that video games are a bastion of queer representation. Nicholas Ware expands this in his essay, Iterative Romance and Button-Mashing Sex, Gameplay Design and Video Games' Nice Guy Syndrome. Optimism about games as a progressive sexuality learning space is largely based on an assumption of proper representation of non-heteronormative relationships. Always a question mark in a games market that seems to cater to heterosexual adolescent males more than any other demographic, and unfortunately does not consider the ramifications of gameplay design and strategy. Video games need to be considered in a different way to traditional media due to how their mechanics can shift a game's themes. Before we dig in any further, I'd like to discuss how I'm going to be using the term bisexual in this essay. Unless stated otherwise, it should be considered similar to using pan or polysexual. While there is much discussion in queer theory about the differences between these terms, especially in relation to a heteronormative society, I'm choosing to use bisexual for one major reason. The games I'm about to discuss show little to no representation of any other gender identity other than the binary male and female. While players of any gender identity can obviously play and enjoy these games, their in-game characters are strictly limited in their forms of gender expression. As such, these games only show relationships between heterosexual couples, homosexual, and bisexuals. Add a dash of exosexual in there too if you class Mass Effect's Asari, who act, talk, and look identical to women but are blue, as aliens. One aspect of modern queer representation in video games actually has me questioning just how representative these are, or if that's even the goal when including the LGBTQ themes. The issue I'm isolating here for discussion is what I've chosen to call the Bisexual Mechanic. And no, that's not a Kindle exclusive erotica novel. It's what I believe to be the most common form of queer depiction in video games. Also known in areas of game queer theory as the gay button. This is a romance mechanic in choice-driven games. Non-player characters who show little to no queerness or deviance from heterosexual norms can be chosen by the player or their player character. The NPC then enters a queer relationship with the PC. This is also known by some scholars and writers as the characters being player sexual. The PC's gender makes no difference in being able to choose these characters as a romance option. The NPCs can show little to no interest in romance or sex, yet the second the player character becomes interested in them through the game's mechanics, they suddenly become queer. Take for example the marriage mechanic in Bethesda's 2011 game, The Elder Scrolls V: Skyrim. In the game, there are over 60 NPCs that can be married by the player. These are men and women of various races, of both the human and fantasy variety, from a multitude of various backgrounds, jobs, political leanings, amongst other variables. With such a diverse cast, it doesn't take much to imagine the vast amount of sexual ideologies that could cover, yet each and every character is bisexual. Whether you're a male or a female in-game, it doesn't matter. As long as you have an amulet of Mara equipped, each and every one of these characters will show interest in becoming your player character's most beloved.
Is that an amulet of Mara? I'm surprised someone like you isn't spoken for. Well, yes. Why wouldn't I be? Are you interested in me? It's settled then. Brief as life can be in Skyrim, at least we'll have each other.
So this means that Skyrim is a sexually progressive utopia. Well, that, or developers have become so focused on accommodating players' sexualities that the world of Skyrim is either a queer utopia or decidedly the opposite, a heteronormative space. So, we have 60 plus characters here who are mechanically bisexual. Yet, if the player doesn't show any interest in them at all, they don't show it. Therefore, 60 characters that could be potentially queer are actually just player sexual. They aren't canonically bisexual until the player shows interest. The vast majority of society is heterosexual, and while some will choose to roleplay their characters with a differing sexuality, most will choose to align their character's sexuality with their own, and as such will not encounter any non-hetero characters. There are actually 2 NPCs in Skyrim who are hinted at being homosexual lovers, yet they're such minor characters that it's not a stretch to call them easily missable. Plus they're dead, which is a whole other problematic form of representation. So Skyrim could technically call itself progressive and queer friendly, yet if someone doesn't play it that way, they'll encounter no queerness at all. And Skyrim is far from the only game to follow this mechanical trend. Games ranging from the massive budget first-party titles such as Fable to the indie darling one-man creation Stardew Valley allow you to shape the world as queerly or as queerless as you would like. Mia Consalvo gestures towards this in her essay, Hot Dates and Fairy Tale Romances, Studying Sexuality in Video Games. She writes, thus, in a subtle way, the naturalness of heterosexual relations is enforced through the use of certain images and the omission of others. Also, she adds, representation or performance can be subverted both through the actions of the player and the structure of the game itself. If players see an echo chamber of their own beliefs, it takes away a major component of what makes media so great, and that's the ability to challenge a participant's views, to ask a player to re-evaluate their notions and potentially grow as people. While of course I would prefer the Bisexual Mechanic's depiction of queer characters over nothing, unfortunately it can't replace good, canonical queer representation.
Here we go. I'm bisexual.
2 examples from the blockbuster end of video games come in the form of Grand Theft Auto 5's Trevor Phillips and Metal Gear Solid series' Vamp. Unfortunately, both fall into the media trope of the depraved bisexual. They're actually psychopaths. Their bisexuality is, at least seemingly in the writer's eyes, yet another example of how they are perverted deviants. The BioWare game series, Dragon Age and Mass Effect, both include characters with set sexualities, including bisexuals such as Zevran Aranai and Kelly Chambers. Yet they only express these feelings in a direct response to sexual interest from the player character. Until that interest is noted, they are effectively sexless. So while these characters do have canonical bisexuality, they fall into the player sexual trap that we encountered with Skyrim. I really struggled finding a character who was represented as bisexual without their character's sexuality revolving around the player character in a player sexual way. However, there was one example I found that actually turned out to be a fascinating way of including in-game mechanics to flesh out a character's sexuality and backstory. Ted Ustinov, a minor character from Sega's 2008 strategy game Valkyria Chronicles, is canonically bisexual. This is expressed in the character traits fancies men and fancies women. If he is accompanied by characters of either gender, there are random chances of his accuracy to be boosted. What makes this a standout example of queer representation is not only does this expand his canonical personality, but it affects his character's mechanical performance in-game too. Sadly, this engaging form of queer mechanic in character building is yet to find its way into the wider world of video games. What can be done to improve the level of bisexual representation going forward in video games? The key to creating good representation is to allow characters in these universes to express their sexuality excluded from the sexual interests of the player character, obviously where this is appropriate. BioWare's 2014 game, Dragon Age Inquisition, actually makes steps towards this. If the player character chooses not to get romantically involved with Dorian or Iron Bull, those 2 characters will separately later on engage in their own sexual relationship, excluding the player.
That staff's in pretty good shape, Dorian. You spend a lot of time polishing it?
Yet this game stands as the only example almost 8 years later. Another avenue this could take would be for developers to start creating their worlds to not be centric around player characters. While it might go against the common concept of video games being power fantasies, developers should not be afraid of approaching the awkwardness that is involved in one-way attraction. Video games are lagging behind the other major entertainment forms regarding their queer representation. Yet they have the potential to exceed those forms tenfold. As technology progresses, we are seeing major new storytelling mechanics and techniques emerge year on year. In the hands of the right creator, possibilities are potentially limitless for how sexuality can be represented in video game form, in ways that can make queer players feel seen and accepted by their straight counterparts. Because of this, I trust that within the next decade of games development, the bisexual mechanic, as we know it, will be obsolete.